Kicking off at number 5, Uzumaki, 2000. And if you think this film is weird and terrifying and deeply unsettling, then believe me, this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to body horror. In actual fact though, Uzumaki, also known as Spiral, is perhaps the most traditional of J-horror movies on this list, and it's more akin to the likes of 2001's Pulse or 2002's Ju-On: The Grudge than it is to the pure entertainment factor found in most tongue-in-cheek body horror. And really, if you're looking for a film to be straight up creeped out by, then 2000's Uzumaki is the one for you, and there are more than enough genuinely dread-inducing scenes throughout for a traditional horror fan to get by. And that's without people sprouting shells from their shoulders or growing a sentient head of hair hell-bent on destroying the minds of an entire high school. Released as the feature film debut of Akira Higuchi under the alias of Higuchinsky, Uzumaki is a film presented in 4 parts that slowly unpicks the tale of a small town known as Kuruzu that quickly becomes plagued by a strange fascination for spiralized patterns. As the story drudges onward, the typical high school drama of a girl named Kirei, played by Eriko Hatsune, gradually unwinds as her boyfriend's father becomes obsessed with filming the spiral patterns found on a snail's shell, drawing them in his scrapbooks and trying to recreate the perfect markings. Soon enough, that odd fascination seems to have spread to the entire town, and I won't say any more because what plays out is one of the most bizarre and equally terrifying descents into complete and utter madness. Like many body horror films from Japan, Uzumaki is based off of the 1998 manga of the same name, written and created by Junji Ito, and for the most part, Higuchi's depiction of Ito's work is second to none. Believe me though, this film is weird. Really, really weird. Coming in at number 4, Parasite, 2014. Yeah, my thoughts exactly. The truth of the matter is though, 2014's Parasite is an awesome film, and it remains to be, without a doubt, the most action-packed sci-fi body horror mashup perhaps ever produced by Japan, in a way that only Japanese cinema can seem to capture. This film just wouldn't have been made by Western studios, or it would have, and they would have completely missed out some of the oddly specific details that makes it so awesome. Also, it's important to note that we'll be including part 1 and part 2 of this film series in one point, because it's such a sprawling epic sci-fi horror that it needed 2 movies to leave its mark like the parasitic alien that it is. Although the first film is definitely the better of the 2. Written and directed by Takashi Yamazaki, based upon the 1988 manga of the same name by Hitoshi Iwaki, Parasite tells the tale of a high school student, Shinji Izumi, who, after witnessing an invasion of parasitic aliens that infect humans by crawling into their brain, is partially saved by being fully infected himself after his own parasite failed to bypass his headphones. Pretty lucky, but even luckier for him, Shinichi's parasite instead infects his entire right hand, bestowing on him bizarre body morphing properties in a horror-fueled, super-heroic manner. If you're enticed by that premise, then watch this film. It's important to note though that 2014's Parasite doesn't necessarily use body horror as a consistent means for gross out or fear inducing scenes, although there are a lot of them. In many ways, this film is like if John Carpenter's The Thing actually became a good parasitic life form and bestowed MacReady with supernatural world saving abilities. If that sounds like your cup of tea, then that's exactly what this film is.
In our third spot, we have The Human Centipede. Of course, this movie had to make the list. Only those with a strong stomach are recommended to watch this film. But despite its grossness, apparently the film was a hit, because there's not just 1, not 2, but 3 movies in this franchise. But for today, I'm going to be discussing the film that started it all, the first one. So The Human Centipede is a 2009 Dutch horror film written and directed by Tom Six. The film surrounds a crazed German surgeon who kidnaps 3 tourists and then does a little experiment on them, just a little one. How do I put this nicely? He conjoins them all together. He attaches their backsides to another person's mouth. And then if they have to do their business, well, the person behind them is just greeted with it. Reports say that that scene in particular made a lot of viewers feel sick. Well, I can see why. Then he tortures these individuals and gets them to do other disturbing stuff. Let me know in the comments below if you've seen all 3 of these movies, and let me know which one you thought was the most disturbing. In our second spot, we have The Incredible Melting Man. This 1977 film follows a man that, well, melts. In the film, Steve West is an astronaut who gets sent on a mission to Saturn. However, West and 2 other astronauts get exposed to a radiation blast that kills the 2 astronauts and leaves West severely injured. The radiation makes him melt and turns him into an insane cannibal. He then goes around killing people and consuming their flesh. Apparently, eating flesh slows down his body from melting. Now, here's a little fun fact. This movie was originally intended to be a horror comedy / parody of horror films, but then the director decided to cut out all the comedic scenes and just add more horror scenes. In the film, you can see the main character covered in a nasty, bloody goo kill and eat a bunch of people. In one scene, his eyeball melts out of his socket. Then there's a scene where West attacks a woman through her window and he gets his gooey arm chopped off with a meat cleaver. Nice. And in our number 1 spot, we have The Fly. And I'm talking about the 1986 film directed by David Cronenberg. This film follows the life of Seth Brundle as he experiments with teleportation. Basically, he's working on telepods that can transport someone from one pod to another. However, while doing this, he accidentally gets merged with a fly. And, well, he slowly evolves into a weird, disgusting human fly creature. The first disturbing scene in the movie would have to be when his fingernails fall off. This scene made me cringe. You just see him peeling off his nail. Ew, yikes. But if you can make it past that scene, then you can see him arm wrestle a dude and snap his wrist in half. And you can also see him barf up gross white fly vomit. Then he uses this vomit to dissolve a man's hand and foot. In the final stages of his transformation, you can see his eyeballs melt out of his socket, his head split open, and all the skin on his face just peels off to reveal that human fly creature. So starting off this countdown, we have American Mary. American Mary is a 2012 Canadian body horror film written and directed by the Soska sisters. Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. It stars Catherine Isabelle as Mary Manson, a medical student who is struggling to afford her schooling. As a result, she decides to perform horrific body modification procedures on clients in order to earn some dough. But these surgeries are often very grotesque. One woman gets certain private parts removed in order to look like a human doll. She gets some pieces of her downstairs just sliced off and then sewn together. Then you have 2 twins that want their left arms switched with each other's. If you've got the cash, Mary will perform the surgery, no matter how extreme. Warning, spoiler alert ahead. One of the more intense scenes was when Mary gets revenge on a man named Dr. Grant. She splits his tongue, sews his mouth shut, and worst of all, she cuts off both his arms and legs. His live body is then shown hanging from 2 big fish hooks that are pierced through the skin on his back. But this movie isn't too bad compared to the next ones on this list. Coming in at number 4, we have Basket Case. Basket Case is a 1982 movie written and directed by Frank Henenlotter. And I apologize in advance if I say any of these directors' names wrong. This movie is about 2 twin brothers that are conjoined at birth but then later separated. One of the brothers, Dwayne, looks completely normal, whereas the other one is completely deformed. He looks like a lumpy blob of mashed potatoes with evil eyes and sharp teeth. He is often locked in a wicker basket and carried around by Dwayne. Now, the plot of this movie is that the deformed twin seeks revenge on the doctors who separated them at birth, but there are multiple other people that he kills along the way. In the movie, we see a robber get his face clawed off by him, and one of the doctors gets a bunch of scalpels plunged into her face. Now, this movie isn't so much on the scary side, but back in the day it was considered terrifying. But all the comments I've read about this movie now say that the acting is laughable. Either way, some of the scenes are kind of disturbing, and it's definitely a film on the weirder side.
Next up at number 3, Society, 1989.
It's perfectly normal to experience a certain irrational fear at your age. It's no more than a stage.
Yeah, that's probably the tamest scene we can show of 1989 society that doesn't involve any of the final act, because the final act of this film in particular is something else entirely, and if you've already seen it, then you may shudder at the thought of stumbling upon a dinner party that gets a little weird after the hors d'oeuvres are served, because screw the food, right? Literally. Now, many of you called to see Society on our next list, and rightly so, because the truth is, ever since its release back in the late 80s, there hasn't been a film quite like it. Picture it like this: this film is Ferris Bueller's Day Off, if his truancy involves stumbling into a world only H.P. Lovecraft's weirdest, wildest fever dreams could muster up, and then it was directed by Brian Yuzna, perhaps the greatest cinematic visionary of his works. And it's a good job really, because Society was directed by Brian Yuzna in perhaps his most startlingly grotesque display of body horror to date. And that's saying something. Society tells a tale of a slightly unlikable kid called Bill, which perhaps makes it that much easier to stomach, a popular high school teenager who seems to have all of those boxes ticked, cheerleader girlfriend and brand new Jeep included. His family are incredibly wealthy and live in a huge mansion in Beverly Hills, but there's just something not quite right about them, or any of their friends either, and Bill doesn't trust them in the slightest. Well, of course, that's because they're in fact not his family at all, but members of a strange, grotesque alien species whose only purpose in this life is to homogenize human flesh into one massive, writhing entity in a bizarre, ritualistic, grotesque orgy. Yeah, when it comes to weird, they don't really get any weirder than Society, but in its own unique, brilliantly way, this film is incredibly entertaining. Just please don't watch it whilst you're eating, and if you can stomach a few repeat viewings, then you'll find some fantastic allegorical remarks about the pitfalls of greed and wealth in high society. But yeah, come on, you'll just watch it for Butthead, really, right? Yeah. Coming in at number 2, Tokyo Gore Police, 2008. Yeah, exactly. And truth be told, I'm not entirely sure where to begin with this particular entry. If I said this film was insane, then it truly wouldn't even come close to doing it justice, because when it comes to body horror, Tokyo Gore Police has it all. Mutated alien tumor head arms, cybernetic eyes, jet fuel blood propelled samurai police chiefs, alligator mermaid people. Yeah, and that's not even the half of it. Although that I stated in our previous list that David Cronenberg was the godfather of body horror, and I still stick to that statement, many of you rightfully pointed out that body horror was indeed first born in Japan, and yes, it was, but the truth of the matter is, body horror in Asian cinema is a complete and utter different kettle of mutated fish, and to do it justice, it probably needs an entire list of its own. But the champion of that whole genre is definitely 2008's Tokyo Gore Police, being all of those things condensed into one. Co-written and directed by Yoshihiro Nishimura, the man responsible for the unearthly special effects in 2005's Meatball Machine, Tokyo Gore Police tells the tale of a young police officer named Ruka, played by Aiki Shina, a woman from Tokyo whose father was mysteriously assassinated when she was a girl and who has been seeking vengeance ever since. Classic, right? The thing is though, this isn't any old normal Tokyo, but instead a city under the influence of a bizarre, mutagenic scientist known as Keyman, who has infected copious amounts of people with a strange virus that causes them to sprout mutated weapons from any injury. Yeah, that's kind of all you need to know really, because all of those aforementioned things are just the tip of the blood-soaked iceberg when it comes to Tokyo Gore Police. And yes, this film is gross and weird and visually perplexing, but it never takes itself too seriously. And as so far as Splatterhouse gore goes, this is one of the most entertaining movies ever made. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Brain Dead, 1992. Peter Jackson, what the hell were you smoking, my man? And truth be told, I've wanted to slip this film onto a list for a long time, and there's no better time like the present, because Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive, is one of the most insanely entertaining desecrations of the human form ever presented in cinema. This film will, without a doubt, make you say, what the hell did I just watch? I'm not entirely sure. I better watch it again to find out exactly what's going on. Oh no. Yeah, it's that good, but it's also the definition of disgusting body horror, and start to finish, well, within the first 15 minutes, you'll be on the verge of spewing chunks like a pus-ridden Mount Vesuvius. Sorry, perhaps that was laying it on a little strong, but seriously, this film is gross. Written and directed by Peter Jackson with a story penned by Steven Sinclair, Brain Dead tells the tale of Lionel Cosgrove, an unassuming man who lives with his domineering mother, Vera, in a huge Victorian mansion in the suburbs of Wellington, New Zealand. Unbeknownst to him, Lionel's mother gets bitten by a ravenous fabulous zombified Sumatran rat monkey, and thus ensues the grotesque chaos as Vera rapidly falls to pieces, whilst also orchestrating a zombie-ridden takeover of the entire neighbourhood. This film has more blood, gore and guts than most of the entries on this list combined, and it's all framed neatly by the staggeringly convincing incompetence of a lawnmower-wielding Lionel as a wet-behind-the-ears son trying to confront his domineering mother. Also, it's important to note that this film is absolutely hilarious for the most part, and the gore is painstakingly complemented by some incredibly tight dialogue and characterization. If you've ever heard of Brain Dead but never had the urge to sit through it, please give it a watch, because it really is as good as it's made out to be. And when it comes to body horror, there's nothing quite like it.
Coming in at 5, Eraserhead. Released in 1977 and directed by David Lynch, Eraserhead is an experimental body horror film starring Jack Nance, who plays Henry, a man who resides alone in a bleak apartment surrounded by industrial gloom. However, when he discovers that an earlier fling with Mary X has left her pregnant, he marries her and has her move in with him. Things then take a decidedly strange turn when the couple's baby turns out to be a bizarre lizard-like creature that won't stop crying. When Henry finally discovers what's beneath the swaddle and bandages of his baby, things take a dark and spine-tingling detour into madness and mutilation. From the baby itself, the non-stop crying, to a terrifying woman in the radiator surrounded by worms, the entire movie is nauseating and disturbing, yet it makes for one hell of a ride, that's for sure. I've also watched this movie too many times on dates. First dates. Probably why I never got a second. Now, despite receiving negative reviews upon its release, in 2004 Eraserhead was selected for preservation in the National Film Registry by the United States Library of Congress. This selection is based on a film being deemed culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. In 2010, the Online Film Critics Society compiled a list of the 100 best directorial debuts, listing what they felt were the best first-time feature films by noted directors. Eraserhead ultimately placed second in the poll, behind Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. More interesting still, Stanley Kubrick revealed to David Lynch that Eraserhead was his favourite film of all time, with it also serving as an influence on Kubrick's 1980 film The Shining. The film currently holds an approval rating of 90%, with the general consensus reading, David Lynch's surreal Eraserhead uses detailed visuals and a creepy score to create a bizarre and disturbing look into a man's fear of parenthood. Coming in at number 4, we have Teeth. Released in 2007 and directed by Mitchell Lichtenstein, Teeth is a horror comedy starring Jess Wexler, who plays Dawn, an active member of a high school chastity club, but when she meets Toby, nature takes its course and the pair answer the call. They suddenly learn she is a living example of the vagina dentata myth, when the encounter takes a grisly turn. Vagina dentata is a folktale in which a woman's vagina is said to contain teeth, with the associated implication that sex may result in severe injury or even castration. Anyway, after Toby tries to assault Dawn, her body comes to her defense, chomping down and biting off his, well, you know. From that point on, Dawn quickly learns that her condition is a means of protection for her against those who might try to harm her. Teeth has some truly terrifying moments that require very little explanation. I mean, the movie is about a vagina with teeth that bites off penises. It's always going to be brutal. Foundation Artistic Director at the Sundance Film Festival, Mistel Brabi, claimed that Teeth was one of the most talked about films at the Sundance Film Festival that year. The film received mostly positive reviews, with it garnering an 80% approval rating, with the general consensus reading, smart, original, and horrifically funny. Teeth puts a fresh feminist spin on horror movie tropes.
Next up at number 3, Meatball Machine, 2005. Talking of parasites, yeah, Meatball Machine, because also, yeah, we can't do a list about Japanese body horror without talking about the strange second cousin of the family that is 2005's Meatball Machine. And yeah, I don't really know how else to put it. To say that this film is insane is to put it lightly, but as I also often say, horror fans, therein lies the point of it. For fans of straight up splatterhouse gore with some of the most insanely exaggerated physical effects that only true B-movie horror can pump out, Meatball Machine is the cherry on the top of the gore-ridden cake. Also, if you can get your hands on the 1999 short that is based on by Junichi Yamamoto, be my guest, but for the most part we'll be looking at the 2005 feature release of this film. I mean, both of them are the same story and it's also equally insane, not like it matters. in any way. Co-directed by Yudai Yamaguchi and Junicho Yamamoto, Meatball Machine tells the tale of Yoji, a stereotypical loner that works in a factory where the highlight of his day is pining over his co-worker and unrequited love, Sachiko, although he's unable to tell her of his undying affection. But unluckily for him, that's before Sachiko is infected by a strange alien object that rapidly turns her into a grotesque biomechanical monster known as a Necroball that have unwittingly infected the entire planet, contorting human flesh into machinery in order to create a bizarre array of deadly weaponry. And as chance would have it, Yoji also gets infected by the Necroborg parasite, and the two would-be lovers descend into a Meatball Machine-induced showdown of blood, guts, gore, and chaos. Yeah, the plot doesn't really matter at all because you won't exactly be watching this movie for the love story of a generation, but that's exactly why it's awesome. Now, many have claimed that Meatball Machine is just a rip-off of Tetsuo the Iron Man, and in some ways it is, but Meatball Machine sticks out like a sore thumb in his own uniquely brilliant way, and for all the right reasons. Give this one a watch. Swinging in at number 2, Mutant Girl Squad, 2010. Alright guys, now we're hitting the outer extremities of this particular list where the opposing forces of weirdness and entertainment start to collide in all their gory glory. You see, the thing is, body horror in Japanese cinema as well as television and literature is so widespread that in more recent times, taking the desecration of the human form and turning it into pure horror-fueled entertainment in a mishmash of all jumbles of genres has become an art in and of itself. Mutant Girl Squad is perhaps the apex of that art, and it is in fact one of the weirdest and insanely entertaining movies to have ever been released in recent times, whilst also just being straight up disgusting. But obviously in a good way, which is an incredibly unique and difficult thing to do well. Written and directed by Nobuo Eguchi alongside Yoshihiro Nishimura and Tak Sakaguchi, Mutant Girl Squad is a heroic story like no other. It tells the tale of a 16-year-old high school student who, after being relentlessly bullied at school, one day conveniently discovers that she's the direct ancestor of an ancient line of mutant warriors, and soon starts growing a mutagenic metallic claw on her right hand that has a habit of slicing and dicing its unfortunate victims in all manners of gore-induced violence. Strangely enough though, despite its outrageous premise, Mutant Girl Squad actually packs an incredibly entertaining narrative beneath its grotesque visual effects. This film is hilarious in places, it's entirely ridiculous and completely over the top, but it doesn't take itself too seriously without detracting from its enjoyment. It's extreme, it's full of all manners of gonzo gore, and it's jammed to the rafters with bizarre scene after bizarre scene, but once you just let it do its thing, there's a real charm to 2010's Mutant Girl Squad, and in a genre of pure chaos and insanity, it still manages to pack some serious heart. Give it a watch, you will not be disappointed with this film. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Akira, 1988. As it remains, we cannot talk about Japanese body horror without talking about this film. It just couldn't ever happen. And while some of you may find umbrage with an animated movie finding its way to our top spot on this list, I'd have to wholeheartedly disagree with you, because whilst being one of the most complete displays and demonstrations of the true meaning behind Japanese body horror, this is also perhaps one of the finest animated films ever made, horror or otherwise. Akira is for the most part a cautionary tale, and when you pick apart the flesh and sinew that have emerged from the machine, the underlying message behind the price that we pay to augment the human form becomes clearer and clearer. You won't necessarily find everything that you're looking for in a horror film here, but perhaps more importantly than that, you'll be left with an idea of the essence behind body horror. For those of you that haven't seen Akira, I'd strongly suggest that you do so, and because of that, I'll try my hardest not to spoil anything. Written and directed by Katsuhiro Otomo, based upon his 1982 manga of the same name, Akira paints the picture of a dystopian Neo-Tokyo in an oppressive, sprawling metropolis under the sway of an oppressive and incredibly powerful military technocracy. Two best friends and members of a rebel biker gang, Kanada and Tetsuo, unwittingly become involved in a bizarre military conspiracy that seeks to draw out latent psychic powers that lie within unique individuals. And that's it, because you'll have to discover the rest for yourself. For fans of anything to do with pure fragments of horror, science fiction, cyberpunk, dystopian speculation, the futuristic apocalypse, whatever, there's so much to be found in 1988's Akira. Yes, this film is animated, and yes, it may waylay the pure joy found in grotesque physical effects, but believe me, me, the animation and pure craft poured into this film is legendary for a reason. This is one of the most perfect films ever made, and the fact that we can feature it at the top spot of our Japanese body horror list is just a bonus. Also, there's a live action adaptation slated to be released in 2021, which is being directed by none other than Taika Waititi, and although die-hard fans of this film may wince at that thought, I've got an inkling that body horror is about to make a resurgence.
In at number 5 we have Tusk. I know a lot of you hate this movie, but I love it and I absolutely love discussing it, so let me have this. Directed by Kevin Smith and released in 2014, Tusk is a body horror comedy starring Justin Long, Haley Joel Osment and Genesis Rodriguez. The plot concerns a US podcaster played by Long, who ventures into the Canadian wilderness to interview an old man who has an extraordinary past, and the American quickly learns the man has a dark secret involving a walrus. The idea for the film came during the recording of Smodcast 259, The Walrus and the Carpenter. In the episode, Smith and producer Scott Mosier discussed an article featuring a Gumtree ad where a homeowner was offering a living situation free of charge if the lodger agrees to dress as a walrus. This in turn resulted in the creation of the movie after Smith had his Twitter followers vote on whether they would want to see that on screen. Now, while the Gumtree ad turned out to be fake, the movie was released with Smith taking things to the extreme, with Justin Long's character having his legs amputated and being sewn into a walrus suit. And the moment we finally see Mr. Tusk in all its disturbing glory, well, it's not easily forgotten and will linger with you for years to come. Love it or hate it, Tusk is undoubtedly a disturbing body horror that is tough to swallow. Ultimately met with mixed reviews, the movie garnered a 45% approval rating, with the general consensus reading, Tusk is pleasantly ridiculous and charmingly self-deprecating, but that isn't enough to compensate for its thin, overstretched story. I disagree there. I thought it was genius. Who doesn't want to be a walrus? In at number 4 we have The Incredible Melting Man. Directed by William Sachs and released back in 1977, The Incredible Melting Man concerns an astronaut whose body begins to melt after he is exposed to radiation during a space flight to Saturn, driving him to commit murders and consume human flesh to survive. The film starred Alex Ribar as the main character, alongside Bird Benning as a scientist trying to help him. The screenplay was originally intended as a parody of horror movies, but comedic scenes were ultimately edited out during production and new horror scenes added. Sachs apparently didn't agree with this move, with producers being the ones who decided shooting a straight horror film would be more financially successful, with the film suffering as a result. Despite that, the gruesome visuals and makeup effects from pioneer Rick Baker were undeniably impressive, with one of the more disturbing scenes being when our hero, Steve West, attacks a woman through a window, resulting in him getting his melting arm chopped off by a meat cleaver in the process. Now, the movie received horrendous reviews, with it currently holding a mere 8% on Rotten Tomatoes, with Chud.com stating, "The Incredible Melting Man is a singular theatrical experience that truly lives up to its crazed pulpy title." Originally intended as an homage to the great atomic age horrors of the 50s, William Sachs' clever satire was recut by its original distributor to cash in on the horror craze.
Next up at number 3, From Beyond, 1986.
Humans are such easy prey. Let her go! Oh,
And you may be expecting the legendary Reanimator to fill this space instead of From Beyond, and in many ways, rightfully so, as Stuart Gordon's incredible interpretation of the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft is one of the finest Splatterhouse movies ever made. But as far as disgusting, twisted body horror goes, his next foray into the perverse side of science fiction and cosmic horror is the better demonstration of the two. From Beyond is a gross film, there is no doubt in it, and it's in its portrayal of science gone wrong where we're treated to some of the most insanely eye-opening physical effects. In fact, what starts as a film similar in tone to Reanimator, with some low-budget humour and deadpan delivery from the awesome Jeffrey Combs, quickly turns into a stomach-churning thrill ride of over-exaggerated gore and the gut-wrenching physical realisation of some of the more insaner Lovecraftian narrative concepts. Written and directed by Stuart Gordon alongside his production squad of Dennis Powley and Brian Yuzna, From Beyond is based upon the short story of the same name by H.P. Lovecraft, and yet it takes a few more twists and turns into its descent into the darker side of human consciousness. It tells the tale of two scientists, Pretorius and Tillinghast, who've developed a machine known as the Resonator that simulates the human pineal gland in the search to find other dimensional planes. Well, of course, as we all know, when you go meddling with the many layers of cosmic horror, of course it's filled to the brim with terrifying fleshy creatures and writhing tentacle-ridden monstrosities. Yeah, if you want body horror, From Beyond has it in spades from start to finish, and it's both great and gross the whole while through. Swinging in next at number 2, Altered States, 1980.
Defy it, Eddie. You made it real, you can make it unreal.
If you can't tell already, science and body horror go hand in hand. And although we've rightly given credit to the godfather of body horror, David Cronenberg, particularly in the likes of The Fly, Videodrome and Scanners, there is one classic of conceptual body horror that we all may have forgotten about. Ken Russell's mind-bending 1980 science fiction existential horror, Altered States. And if you haven't seen this film, then I'm not exactly sure what to tell you, because really, it's something else entirely. Now, it's important to note that whilst the physical effects of this film aren't exactly in league with the likes of Cronenberg and the Lovecraftian works of Stuart Gordon, it's in the implication of this particular body horror where the true gross out and terror of this film lies. Directed by the off-the-wall legend of cinema that is the late great Ken Russell, the man responsible for 1971's The Devils, as well as the epic musical Tommy, based on the album of the same name by The Who, Russell's diverse and often overwhelming cinematic catalogue probably sums up just how strange and weird Altered States really is. It tells the tale of Edward, a scientist played by William Hurt in his debut role, who becomes obsessed with the notion of other states of consciousness, and so he descends into an addiction of sensory deprivation tanks and hallucinogenic drugs in the pursuit of reaching them. But of course, this is a horror film, and that particular cautionary tale of curiosity killing cats comes with a price. This film is insane. It's everything mashed up into one, and it will make you think twice whether we really are just meat sacks being piloted by our own brains. And finally, coming in at our number 1 spot, Tetsuo the Iron Man, 1989. Because we just have to end with a bang, and there is no other film that could have quite lived up to just exactly how bad crazy Tetsuo the Iron Man really is. There are a few rules to body horror, I suppose, that keeps it in line with the narrative intention without just ending up like a torture porn flick akin to The Human Centipede or others of its ilk. But in its own equally unique way, Tetsuo takes a look at those rules and throws them off the top of a damn building. Where do I even begin with this film? I know that I say that quite a lot, but really it's never been more appropriate. Imagine if David Lynch took Eraserhead and then made it watch The Fly and then buzzed it up with some German experimental cinema and then released the whole thing in Japan. And then you'll kind of get an idea just how insanely messed up this movie really is. But in a strange way, it's also awesome. I mean, the reason you're even watching this list is because body horror can gross you out in all of the best ways, and Tetsuo the Iron Man will gross you out with every single frame. I almost can't even explain the plot without fear of somehow giving you guys the wrong impression. Written and directed by Shinya Tsukamoto, Tetsuo is a cyberpunk horror film that tells a tale of a man obsessed with metal and the lengths that he'll go to fulfill his twisted desires. Kind of. Yeah. Honestly guys, as far as body horror goes, this is the tippity top of the Machine Man metal pile. I don't even know what else to say, just watch it and be prepared, I guess, please. Kicking off at number 5, 1973.
Look for your legs, they're gone. Feel your body, it's cold. And listen for the hissing.
And yeah, is the actual title of this film. That's just not me getting randomly possessed by a demonic serpentine entity. Although it has happened before, and let me tell you, being a snake ain't easy. Also released as the much more palatable Snake in the UK and Japan, as well as the far more entertaining Silbido de Muerte in Spain, this 1973 serpentine body horror was directed by Bernard Kowalski and co-written by Hal Dresner and Daniel Strapecki, with startling attention to detail in the actual science behind snakes. It's important to note that this film is definitely of the campy variety, and the otherwise solid plotline often falls short to some incredible feats of overacting. But for a film made in the early 70s that was intended for television, focused on the horror behind a mad scientist turning people into snakes, it definitely ticks all of the boxes for 99 minutes of pure Friday night horror entertainment. Snake tells the tale of Dr. Carl Stoner, played by Strother Martin, a herpetologist who has dedicated his life's work to studying the strange scientific mysteries of reptiles, and who has a particularly venomous interest interest in the world of snakes. As you may imagine, well, turns out that Dr. Stoner isn't exactly your run-of-the-mill serpent fanatic, and instead is convinced that humanity is on a non-stop ride to extinction, and thinks that the only way to stop that is to turn the entire human population into bizarre snake-human hybrids who can otherwise thrive in pollution. Yeah, you can see where the body horror is going with this one, right? Well, in fact, for a film made in 1973, the special effects from John Chambers and Nick Marcellino are staggeringly convincing and equal parts scale and fangs gross. I mean, this film is perhaps on the tamer side compared to some of the other entries on this list, but if you're in the mood for dipping your toe in the murky waters of body horror, then this is definitely a worthy starting point. Swinging in next at number 4, Nightbreed, 1990. And yes, whilst Hellraiser most definitely deserves to be on this list for gore alone, when it comes to body horror, perhaps Clive Barker's most complete display of physical plastic weirdness comes with his underrated dark fantasy show-stopping epic, Nightbreed, a film that is so often overlooked that it never truly received the recognition it deserved. And yeah, that may be down to the fact that on the surface, Nightbreed isn't for everyone, but when you cut away from all the immediately apparent grotesque visual horror, this film is strangely heartwarming in a way that only Clive Barker could pull off, because those terrifying abominations of flesh, twisted metal and demonic leather, yeah, they're the good guys. Written and directed by the legendary Clive Barker based upon his novella Cabal, written in 1988, Nightbreed tells the tale of a young man named Boone who is under the malevolent sway of his psychotherapist Dr. Philip Decker, played by David Cronenberg himself, may I add, and is convinced by Decker that he's a serial killer responsible for a chain of grisly murders. Seeking refuge in a mysterious cemetery, Boone stumbles upon the last remnants of the grotesque creations of folklore who've hidden away for eons in their final stronghold of Midian, a refuge for all of those things that go bump in the night. I won't say any more because although Nightbreed's plot was torn apart by critics, don't listen to that shtick, because Clive Barker's Nightbreed is a strangely weird but lovable dark fantasy body horror that has been stripped of every organ except its heart, which is a weird thing to say, but that's also why it's awesome. It's equal parts grotesque and equal parts bizarre horror goodness, and that's reason enough to give it a look over. Also, if you can get your hands on the director's cut from 2016, do it.
Coming in at number 3, Cabin Fever. Released back in 2002 and directed by Eli Roth in his directorial debut, Cabin Fever is a horror comedy body horror that follows a group of college graduates who rent a cabin in the woods for spring break. However, unbeknownst to them, an infection has taken hold of a hermit who lives in the woods, and after one of the students, Bert, accidentally shoots the man, he shows up at their cabin, resulting in the group becoming exposed to the deadly infection. It's a run-of-the-mill horror with some truly disturbing imagery, including skin peeling off and bloody vomiting. The bathtub scene has truly stuck with me for life. Whenever I shave my legs, I have the genuine fear that today may be the day that the skin comes off completely. The inspiration for the movie's story was actually born out of reality, with it coming from Roth's real-life experience during a trip to Iceland when he developed a skin infection. The movie is an homage to low-budget horrors including Night of the Living Dead, Deliverance, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, The Evil Dead, and The Blair Witch Project. Peter Travers of Rolling Stone stated that, I quote, "Cabin Fever finds an unusually potent blend of dread, gore, and gallow humor, and is a blast of good, gory fun that just won't quit." The movie currently holds a 62% approval rating, with the general consensus reading, "More gory than scary, Cabin Fever is satisfied with paying homage to genre conventions rather than reinventing them." Despite its mixed reviews, the movie did go on to spawn a handful of sequels and even a prequel, with Ty West directing the 2009 sequel, Cabin Fever 2: Spring Fever. In at number 2, we have The Fly. Now, a lot of you were upset that I didn't include The Fly on part 1 of our list, but I wanted to include some fresh picks, movies that we don't discuss as much on this channel. However, here it is now, so you can all rest easy. Released in 1986 and directed by David Cronenberg, The Fly is a science fiction body horror film starring Jeff Goldblum and Gina Davis. Based loosely on the 1957 short story of the same name, the film tells the story of an eccentric scientist, Seth Brundle, who after one of his experiments goes wrong slowly turns into a fly hybrid creature. Now, what makes this movie so fantastic is the simple fact that if you were to watch the first half of The Fly, you may very easily confuse it for a quirky romance about a reporter who falls in love with the somewhat antisocial scientist. However, not long after Seth Brundle begins to transform, completely changing the atmosphere of the movie. From that point on, it's filled to the brim with awful imagery, including acidic vomit, impregnation horror, and of course the final product, the Brundlefly. The Academy Award-winning makeup was designed and executed by Chris Wallace over a period of 3 months, with the transformation process intending to be a metaphor for the aging process. To that end, Brundle loses his hair, teeth, and fingernails, with his skin becoming more and more discolored and lumpy. The Fly was critically acclaimed upon its release, with most of the praise going to Jeff Goldblum's performance and the special effects. Film critic Gene Siskel named The Fly as the 10th best film of 1986, and to this day the film holds a 92% approval rating, with the general consensus reading, David Cronenberg combines his trademark affinity for gore and horror with strongly developed characters, making The Fly a surprisingly affecting tragedy. And finally, coming in at number 1, Slither. This is honestly one of my favourite films. We don't talk about it enough. I feel like this is the first time I'm talking about it. I could be wrong. Released in 2006 and directed by James Gunn in his directorial debut, Slither is a horror comedy body horror movie starring Nathan Fillion, Elizabeth Banks, and Michael Rooker. The movie takes place in the small town of Wellesley in South Carolina that becomes invaded by a malevolent alien parasite after a meteorite housing the monsters comes crashing down to Earth. Now, it's always been clear as day that James Gunn's mind doesn't work the same way as everyone else's does, with Slither perhaps being his most screwed up movie to date. Now, these parasitic aliens begin infecting the residents of the small town in a truly disgusting way, with Grant, played by Rooker, being the first person infected and becoming a disgusting tentacle-clad creature. He then goes on to infect a woman with hundreds of alien babies, resulting in her body swelling up like a giant balloon. Honestly, this film is, as I like to say, tough to swallow, but a damn good time regardless. While the movie was a box office failure, it did receive positive reviews from critics, with it since being dubbed a cult film. Producer Paul Brooks offered an explanation as to why Slither may have failed to catch on with filmgoers, stating, "I think that because it was a comedy horror instead of pure horror is where the problem lay. It's the first comedy horror in a long time, and maybe the marketplace just isn't ready for comedy horror yet. It's difficult to think of other explanations." Despite that, the film now holds an 86% approval rating, with the general consensus reading, "A slimy B-movie homage oozing with affection for low-budget horror films, so that it's creepy and fun, if you've got the stomach for it." Slither also went on to be listed as one of the top 25 DVDs of the year by Peter Travers in Rolling Stone magazine back in 2006.
Kicking off at number 5, Tusk, 2014.
With the venom traveling to your heart, it forced the doctor to save your life, to take rather, as we say, drastic measures.
Alright guys, Tusk is messed up. So messed up that when Kevin Smith announced it, people were so excited that he was making a new movie, and then within that same breath were absolutely disgusted by how damn messed up his newest creation was. But that isn't to say that it's not just straight up horror goodness, because it is. It's just really, really gross, wrapped up in the most surprising of all animalistic packages, the walrus. Written and directed by the off-the-wall genius Kevin Smith, Tusk tells the tale of a podcast host named Wallace, played by Justin Long, who heads to the remote north of Canada to interview a grizzled old sailor who promises to reveal a lifetime of interesting stories as new material for his show. What's that got to do with the walrus, you may ask? Well, I'll let you find out for yourself. Just bear in mind that Tusk is equal parts hilarious, but only in the way that the most nightmarish of fever dreams can be. The thing is, Kevin Smith is a divisive filmmaker regardless of your stance on this movie. You either love his work or you think it's pointless and you hate it, and many people felt the same about Tusk in particular. For the most part, it was torn apart by critics, but if my opinion holds any weight with top 5 scary viewers, then trust me, Tusk is one of the best attempts at modern body horror in a long time, and it's freakishly unique in its own perverse way. This film is absurd, and it defines the horrific hilarity of the human form being stripped away and broken down on several different levels. As a surprising side note, Justin Long is awesome in Tusk, as is Michael Parks as the terrifyingly convincing serial killer turned veterinary surgeon, Howard. Watch this film, and the next time you go to a zoo, you'll think twice about what's behind the bars. Coming in at number 4, Slither, 2006. Slither, an underappreciated precious gem of a movie and a worthy entry into the halls of horror fandom. If you're expecting scares from this particular film, please don't hold your breath, but if you're in the mood for some of the grossest physical effects in the genre, as well as some of the most genuinely hilarious moments in horror comedy, then this one is for you. Written and directed by James Gunn in his first ever directorial debut, Slither was written by a horror fan for horror fans, and it's a throwback to pretty much every B-movie ever made, all wrapped up neatly in the most disgusting of horror concepts, a malevolent alien parasite that injects its larva into a town full of humans. That's a great start for any body horror, right? Slither tells a tale of the small town of Wheelsy, South Carolina that becomes the host of a sentient alien parasite that crash lands in the surrounding wilderness and subsequently infects the local man about town, Grant, played by the absolutely incredible and equal parts hilarious Michael Rooker. Of course, that's just the beginning, because what ensues is a writhing descent into the desecration of the human body in the most disgusting way possible, as people become wrapped up in the alien parasite's insatiable hunger for breeding with human flesh. And I do mean that literally. Following its release in 2006, this film was a complete flop at the box office, but hey, body horror is an acquired taste, right? Just like alien larva. Ugh. Gross.
In at number 3 we have Videodrome, directed by David Cronenberg and released back in 1983. Videodrome is a Canadian science fiction body horror film starring James Woods, Sonia Smits and Debbie Harry. Set in Toronto during the early 80s, Videodrome follows the CEO of a small UHF television station, Max Wren, who stumbles upon a broadcast signal featuring violence and torture. The layers of deception and mind-controlled conspiracy unfold as he uncovers the signal's source and loses touch with reality in a series of increasingly bizarre hallucinations. Wren quickly realizes that he has bitten off more than he can chew when he begins to experience these hallucinations, such as his torso transforming into a slot that can play video cassettes. In the scene, the movie's villain declares, "I've got something I want to play for you," before popping a pulsating organic videotape into Wren's body. It's very sapphic. The film currently holds an 80% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the general consensus reading, "Visually audacious, disorientating and just plain weird. Videodrome's musings on technology, entertainment and politics still feel fresh today." Trace Thurman of Bloody Disgusting listed it as one of 8 horror movies that were ahead of their time. Not to mention it was also selected as one of the 23 weirdest films of all time by Total Film, and that's pretty spot on. Videodrome is a classic for horror movie fans, however it's definitely tough to swallow, especially if you're going in and not knowing what you're going to get. In at number 2 we have The Human Centipede. Directed by Tom Six and released back in 2009, The Human Centipede tells the story of a deranged German surgeon who kidnaps 3 tourists and joins them surgically, mouth to forming a human centipede. At this point, the movie is notorious and requires little explanation, but I'll proceed anyway. Now, whether you've watched this movie or not, you've certainly heard about them, especially the first one, also known as The Human Centipede First Sequence. It is by far one of the most outrageous and disgusting works of body horror, with even veteran horror lovers running a mile away from it. But don't fret, I've watched it twice. The movie is not something you will forget easily, if ever. The image of the 3 innocent people attached, mouth to haunting your dreams for a long time afterwards. By far the most disturbing moment for me, anyway, is when they realise they will eventually have to go to the bathroom, and there is absolutely nothing they can do about it but slowly pass it along to the person behind them, mouth to if you get what I'm saying. On top of that, no scene is sicker than the one in which crazed Dr. Heiter wakes up his creation, who are now sewn together as they cry out in terror and he weeps tears of joy. The film of course polarized critics and viewers alike, with it garnering a 50% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with the general consensus reading grotesque, visceral and hard to swallow. This surgical horror doesn't quite earn its stripes because the gross outs overwhelm and devalue everything else. Despite receiving mixed reviews, the movie did go on to win several awards in 2009, including Best Picture/Movie at Fantastic Fest, Screamfest Horror Film Festival, and the Saint Maxime International Horror Film Festival. Not to mention it resulted in 2 sequels, creating an epic trilogy. If you're feeling nostalgic for the Human Centipede franchise, don't fret, because if you head over to Tom Six's wiki page, you'll find the Human Caterpillar, which is currently marked as to be announced. I for one cannot wait. And finally, coming in at number 1 we have Antiviral. Directed by David Cronenberg's son, Brandon Cronenberg, and released in 2012, Antiviral is a Canadian-French science fiction horror film starring Caleb Laundrie Jones and Sarah Gadon. The film takes place in a blackly satirical near future where Sid March is employed by the Lucas Clan Clinic, a company which purchases viruses and other pathogens from celebrities who fall ill, in order to inject them into clients who desire a connection with celebrities. Essentially, if you're an obsessed fan, you inject yourself with a celebrity's illness to be just like them. To make extra money, Sid uses his own body as an incubator, steals pathogens from the lab, and sells them on the black market. As you would expect, the movie contains some seriously disturbing body and medical horror as the movie progresses, with it quickly proving that the Cronenberg apple doesn't fall far from the tree. One of the particularly disturbing and noteworthy scenes is a dream sequence in which Sid imagines himself transforming into a twisted fusion of man and machine, and honestly, it will haunt you long after the credits roll. The movie garnered a 66% approval rating, with Tim Roby from the Daily Telegraph calling it an eye-widening delve into conceptual science fiction, with the gruesome verse of his father David Cronenberg's early work and morbidity to match, and says there's real muscle in its ideas, a potent kind of satirical despair, and a level of craft you rarely expect from a first-timer.